There's some things about this PC system requirements chart for Forspoken that make sense and some things that don't. We are going to talk. One reason I was interested in this is that this game is a PS5 and PC exclusive. They're not worried about running this on any older generation consoles. That also means that this is going to be the first PC game with the new DirectStorage technology, which should take huge advantage of a fast NVMe drive. However, they still are listing under the minimum requirements that an HDD is supported, although going up to a fast NVMe SSD should be able to then take advantage of direct storage, fast load times. I'm really interested in how that'll actually play out as the first game doing that. But what more of you guys care about is, can you run the game at all? And they've at least given us a system requirements chart that's better than the old school minimum recommended, no other details, here's some PC parts, wonder how they'll do. But it's not perfect. For one thing, it doesn't tell us the graphic settings that they're targeting, but it does tell us a resolution and a frame rate. So for the minimum requirements, we're seeing a GTX 1060, and they are specifying the 6 gigabyte VRAM version. And by the way, I know some of you guys comment on my system requirement video saying you have a laptop GPU, and how does that pair? Well, the problem with laptop GPUs is that the different laptops have different thermal requirements, and sometimes the laptop version of a GPU is close to its desktop version, sometimes it's very far away. So you'll need to do some research on your particular laptop GPU yourself. I will give a comparison of desktop GPUs and where yours would perform relative to this. Anyway, we're seeing 720p 30 FPS on the GTX 1060, which is still one of the most popular GPUs on Steam. The 1650, which is even weaker than that, has recently surpassed it. So there's still a lot of people down in this space. The AMD GPU here is the 5500 XT. And notice that they're listing 16 gigabytes of RAM as the minimum. Now again, we could test the game when it comes out. Maybe it can run on 8. But usually, for a long time, 8 was the minimum and 16 was recommended. We're now seeing memory requirements going from 16 up to 24 for recommended and 32 gigabytes for 4K ultra settings. So again, we'll see if the game really needs that amount, but RAM requirements seem to be increasing. The minimum CPUs are Ryzen 5 1600 and an Intel Core i7 3770. Now, what does all of this mean? Where does your GPU fall in comparison? Well, what I want to do is look at the recommended specs, and then we'll talk about how these differ and get you an idea of where your stuff would kind of fall in between. So, for 1440p, but notice they're only saying 1440p 30 frames per second. The GPU requirements are jumping up to a Radeon RX 6700 XT and a NVIDIA GTX 3070. So these are fairly comparable performance-wise. Usually the 3070 is a little bit faster. However, I will mention this is an AMD-sponsored title, so it's possible they've done extra work optimizing for AMD GPUs. More on that in a minute when we talk about them putting the 6800 XT up against the RTX 4080 on this 4K chart, which makes absolutely no sense at all, but most people aren't gaming at 4K, so I'll come back to that one in a second. Let's compare these minimum and recommended. Again, 1440p 30 FPS. And notice that they're skipping over 1080p here in between. So yeah, like I said, we're getting a lot of details here, but also leaving something to be desired. Maybe you could drop down to 1080p and get closer to 60 FPS with the same hardware. The CPUs are jumping up to a Ryzen 5 3600 and a Core i7 8700K, and the memory requirements jumping up to 24 gigabytes, and they're no longer listing an HDD, they're recommending an SSD. Now, how does all of this stuff compare? Let's jump into the GPUs first. So the GTX 1060, now I'm using the Tech Power Up relative performance chart. There'll be a link to it in my description. I find this to be, while it's not perfect, in every game, the optimization for different GPUs varies wildly, and as we get newer games on newer APIs, sometimes these older GPUs, like a GTX 1060, do fall behind where their relative performance used to be. But I think this is one of the easier to use and complete and more accurate relative performance charts on the internet. It's a lot better than when you just Google random comparisons and get like user benchmarks, which don't get me started about that place. Anyway, they're listing the GTX 1060 as fairly comparable to a 5500 XT, with the 5500 XT slightly faster. But again, this was the GPU for 720p 30 FPS. Now, it wasn't saying at what graphics settings. Hopefully there'd be room for tweaking or upscaling or something like that. So if you have a GPU weaker than the 1060s, so that could be something like, the RX 480 is basically a tie. That's a similar AMD GPU. Going back to like a 780 Ti, GTX 970 is close to a 1060. It has less VRAM, so that could be an issue. Going back to like an RX 470, that's a bit weaker. A GTX 1650, like I said, the most popular GPU on Steam, is weaker than the 720p 30 FPS GTX 1060 in this game, and RX 6400, which is a new GPU from AMD, came out in the last year or so. It's only 77% of the performance of a GTX 1060, the Arc A380 from Intel. So there are GPUs here. 1050 Ti is still fairly popular on the Steam survey. GTX 960 is only 58% of the performance of a 1060, guys. So there's a lot of people on these older GPUs. So if you're on one of these, like a GTX 1050, that's half the performance. Guys, if the 1060 really does only get you 720p 30 FPS at low settings, I'm afraid a lot of people could be left out of this one, but that's what we might start seeing happen as we get games that are not worried about supporting the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. If it's PS5 exclusive with a PC port, I think this might turn into more of the norm, although I'll be interested to see if it actually does run. Now, if your GPU is more powerful than these, so scrolling up here, we've got 6500 XT is fairly comparable. GTX 980 is a little more powerful. 1650 Super, RX 590, 980 Ti, 1660 Super, 1660 Ti, these are all a bit more powerful. So now you're maybe getting, higher frame rates at 720p, or maybe you're at 1080p 30 FPS. The RTX 3050 and the GTX 1070 are only, a bit faster than the 1060. It's noticeably faster, but if we're only at 720p 30 for real on that 1060, you see why I'm a little bit concerned. 5600 XT, GTX 1080, 59% faster, 60% faster. So I'm trying to give you guys an idea of where your GPU falls in the comparison here. The RTX 2060, 59% faster. RX 6600, 77% faster. So now we're getting into territory where you'd be at least at 60 FPS and maybe pushing into 1080p would be my guess, but they didn't actually list that for us. RTX 2070 and 3060 are fairly comparable at 88% of the performance. 1080 Ti here is now double the performance. 2070 Super, 6600 XT, 2080 Super, 3060 Ti, and now we're getting into the 1440p 30 FPS recommendation here, because the 6700 XT from AMD and the RTX 3070 were listed for this 1440p 30 FPS. And notice that we're more than doubling the performance of their minimum requirement. So you can see here, that's not the one I meant to click on, we can see here that this is a giant gap going from 720p 30 to 1440p 30. So I'm guessing they're also turning up the graphic settings as well in between, because we are more than doubling. And while this resolution does double, graphics performance, usually as you turn up resolution, just because you doubled the pixel count does not mean that you doubled the performance requirement, because not everything in a game is calculated on a per pixel basis, if that makes any sense. Okay, now the CPU requirements jumping from here to here, like I said, memory is already going from 16 to 24, and we're recommending an SSD now. The minimum CPU was a Ryzen 5 1600, which is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, was fairly popular and came out in April of 2017. Whereas the Intel CPU they listed was a i7-3770, which is 4-core, 8-thread, and this is a significantly older CPU from 2012. So, you know, these aren't exactly comparable. Now, another thing that can happen with these low-end system requirements is it's just whatever PC they happen to still have available that's fairly low-end or older, and they're just confirming that it could run it at these settings. So we always need to be careful about reading too much into system requirements. That being said, jumping up to the recommended for 1440p30 CPUs, they're going with the Ryzen 5 3600, which is still 6-core 12-thread, but is a much newer generation, and the gaming performance would have increased quite a bit. And these came out in July of 2019, and this was a very popular, value-oriented gaming CPU for a lot of people. The Intel CPU they listed was the Core i7-8700K at 6-core 12 threads, and this one came out in October of 2017. If you want a rough idea of where yours would compare. Now, if we want to jump into the 4K settings at, 4K Ultra, this is getting a little bit weird. Okay, the CPUs are jumping up again. Now, that could make sense. Usually turning up the most graphic settings doesn't increase the CPU demand that much. But for one thing, it does say that we're jumping up to 60 frames per second now instead of 30. So that makes a difference because you would need a faster CPU to run at a higher frame rate. Also, if we are turning up the graphics settings, as far as I can tell, this game does feature some amount of ray tracing. I think the console's demo has some kind of ray traced shadows, maybe a little bit of ambient occlusion. And as some people don't know, but I'm trying to spread the word, turning up ray tracing settings actually does increase the load on the CPU as well as the GPU. It's both. So anyway, the CPU recommendations here are jumping up pretty significantly to a Ryzen 5 5800X or a Core i7-12700. The 5800X from AMD is the 8-core 16-thread CPU that came out just a couple of years ago. This one came out in 2020, at the end of 2020. And the Core i7-12700 is the core count gets confusing here because Intel moved into performance cores along with efficiency cores. So the performance cores are what would really matter here. So it's just getting to the complicated section of Intel. And this is a very recent January of 2022 CPU and is very, very powerful at gaming. Now, what doesn't make sense here on these 4K requirements is listing a 6800 XT from AMD alongside a 4080 from NVIDIA. These GPUs are not at the same performance tier. You know, the 3070 is a little more powerful than a 6700 XT, but in an AMD optimized game, they can be fairly comparable. A 6800 XT and a 4080 don't make sense to me here. And also they're listing this as a 4K 60 FPS, and the jump from a 6700 XT to a 6800 XT is a big jump, but it's not explaining both going from 1440p to 4K and from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm actually wondering if there's a typo here somewhere in this, or if they didn't mean a 4080, but they meant a 3080, although they did list it with the 16 gigabytes of VRAM that goes along with the 4080. Maybe they just... I don't know, guys. This just doesn't make sense. If we look at a relative performance chart, let's do this. We're going to set the 6700 XT as our baseline now, and we're going to look at how things compare. So if the 6700 XT is our baseline, then, you know, you got a little more powerful GPUs. You got the 6800 and then the 6800 XT. And the 6800 XT is usually this is listing 46% more powerful than a 6700 XT. So it would make sense, you know, to increase the resolution or the frame rate, but increasing both doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, if we set the 6800 XT as the baseline, this is where, like I said, it really gets weird. Because while the 6800 XT in non-ray trace titles is fairly comparable to an RTX 3080, The RTX 4080 is a significant jump in performance from here. Tech PowerUp has it as a 46% average increase in performance. Remember, the 4080 is on par with a 7900 XTX from AMD. This makes very, very little sense. It makes even less sense if this is also factoring in any of the ray tracing settings that this game has. And again, the RAM went up to 32 gigabytes. So, like I said, that's weird. Are you guys interested in me benchmarking this game? The release date is January 24th, so this is coming very, very soon. It's looking like the PlayStation 5 demo, because there is a demo on the PS5, is getting updated later today as well, with some fixes and adjustments. This is listing January 25th, but everything I've seen on like the Steam page is showing the January 24th. Also of note is I am also seeing, I know a lot of people hate games that feature de novo, and it is listing de novo as being, used in this game. So there is that. And also for other information about the PC version of the game, like I said, as far as I know, they did partner with AMD, so it's featuring a lot of AMD Fidelity FX technologies here. I think the hybrid shadows here are those kind of partially ray traced shadows. This game is saying it will support DualSense controller stuff on the PC version of the game, which is good. Support auto HDR under Windows 11. Like I said, DirectStorage under Windows 11. And my knowledge is the game engine in use here is the same game engine that was used by Final Fantasy 15, and it's the same development studio, I believe, as well. What do you guys think about all this? Let me know in the comment section. Do you want me to benchmark this when it comes out? I'm pretty interested in how a PS5 exclusive with a PC port performs on PC, along with DirectStorage and things like that. I hope all of you have an excellent day.